Let's get a little bit more on the background to what is happening. Joining me now is journalist and author of the Palestine Laboratory, who was based in East Jerusalem between 2016 and 2020, Anthony Lowenstein. Anthony, good morning to you. Were you taken by surprise at this audacious operation by Hamas?
Well, surprised by what happened. I mean, no one was really expecting it, but not overly surprised by why it happened. I mean, ultimately, one of the things that I think people need to remember is that if you live in Gaza, and I was reporting there for many years and have spent time there since the last 15 or so years, for the majority of Palestinians there's 2.5 million of them roughly. It's a blockade imposed by Israel and Egypt. And that means basically you don't have freedom of movement, you can't leave when you want, you can't study outside the country very easily. And that's suffocating. And this is not a defense of Hamas by any means. I've spent time with Hamas as a reporter in Gaza, and many Gazans I know don't like Hamas particularly in the past or now. But the truth is that when you occupy a people for decades, and I say that as someone who is Jewish, I'm a Jewish German Australian, and I've reported on this issue for 20 or so years, that I am surprised by obviously the timing of this, but at the same time not at all surprised by the reasons behind it.
OK, what about the timing then? Why do you think it's happening now? What is going on internationally that's brought it to this point?
I think there's a few things going on. In the last years, there's been obviously a huge amount of Arab nations trying to so-called normalise relations with Israel, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco and others. The one at the moment that's not formally secured that relationship is Saudi Arabia, and the US has been pushing that. And Saudi, of course, is a major Arab state. And I think many in Hamas would feel, correctly so, that normalising relations with an occupying power is completely inappropriate. I think it shows that there is almost a power struggle of sorts for Palestinian leadership, that the Palestinian Authority, which is backed by the West, and including Australia, I might add, which is a thuggish, corrupt organisation that runs the West Bank nominally, although Israel ultimately is the occupying power there, has no power. Essentially, it's a contractor for Israel. And I think Hamas wants to show to Palestinians, both in Palestine and across the Arab Muslim world, that in fact they are the leaders of the Palestinian struggle. And I think also finally, obviously I can't clearly get inside Hamas's head, but I think it seems quite likely that a lot of people in the Palestinian movement, both in Australia and around the world, are so infuriated with years and years of Western silence on this. I'm talking about from Australia, US, Europe and elsewhere, that somehow there's a belief that you can lock people up, occupy them. And of course, let's not forget, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International and others have called what's happening in Palestine apartheid. That's their words. Every Israeli human rights organisation has called it apartheid. If that is the case for years, and it is, and I've reported on that myself, as have other journalists, eventually people will snap. People will break. You cannot continue to behave like this as a Jewish state, a self-described moral state, and expect Palestine simply to lie down and accept it.
Of course, the rest of the world, or the Western world at least, is going to support Israel here. And actually Hamas have taken a step over the line, if you like. The taking of hostages, civilian hostages, of which I've seen much footage taken back into Gaza, that leaves the rest of the world united against Hamas, which is a terrorist organisation. Do you see that as a crossing the line?
Look, the reason I think that Hamas is doing that probably is that what, of course, gets far less attention is the fact that Israel has over 1,000 Palestinians in Israeli jails who are
which they would no doubt say are terrorists.
Well, Israel may well claim that, but that's not accepted by virtually any Israeli human rights organisation, Amnesty or Human Rights Watch. I mean, the vast majority of them are there under so-called administrative detention, which means they have no justification in being there. When you occupy a people for that long, look, I don't accept and support the idea of taking civilian hostages at all. Condemn it 110%. I'm not defending that at all. But it's used as a bargaining chip. You see, one of the problems so much, and I've having reported about this for so long, is it's the framing here that we can get outraged in the West about the taking of civilians back into Gaza, fine, but there's far less outrage about the fact that every day this year, and for every year for decades, Palestinian civilians are killed in the West Bank and Gaza. They are killed by Israeli forces. That gets far less international outrage. Now, they're both wrong. Killing civilians is always wrong, regardless of who does it and where. But ultimately, to me, I think that double standard in so much how we as journalists report this is, in my view, a big part of the problem.
Anthony, where do you see the geopolitics of this going? Obviously, to the north, you've got Hezbollah, nothing from that group at the moment there in Jordan. Iran as well, which we know is a supporter of Hamas. Should they become actively involved, the dynamics change. What do you think?
Look, if Hezbollah gets involved, obviously that does change the equation, because for years and years, Israel never really regarded Hamas as a serious military threat. Yes, every 2 or 3 years there's a conflict of sorts or military escalation between the two sides, but Hamas was seen almost as kind of the lesser of the two evils in the Israeli thinking anyway. Hezbollah is a different story. I mean, if Hezbollah gets involved, and I, in many ways, of course, hope they do not, because that massively escalates the situation. Of course, it puts Arab countries in a real bind. I'm talking about Arab leadership here. As I said before, the vast majority of Arab leadership have abandoned Palestinians for years, completely abandoned them to Israel. Why? Because, as I say in my new book, they want to get Israeli repressive technology, surveillance tech, etc. So I think it's going to put a lot of pressure on Arab states, including Saudi, to take a bit of a step back towards Israel. In terms of Western powers, you said before, and you're right, the US, Europe, Australia will 110% support Israel. I don't think that's going to change. But ultimately, what it shows is that the current status quo is not sustainable. It is not sustainable. You can keep on occupying a people for decades and decades and decades. And it's important to note, this is the longest occupation in modern times. It's the longest occupation. And yet now we get outraged by what Hamas does rather than getting equally outraged by a day-to-day grinding occupation. And to me, I think Arab states are going to be put under huge amounts of pressure to not support Israel, or at least be far less supportive of it because of what's happening at the moment.
Anthony Lowenstein, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.